Hello and welcome to this video on some of the weirder history of pharmacology. In this video, we are going to delve into the use of methamphetamines by the Wehrmacht in World War II. Amphetamines, and specifically methamphetamines, are better known today for the societal problems that they create. Degeneracy, addiction, crime, and destroying people's lives. With this you might think meth and its variants is a new drug, but it goes well back to the 1880s. But even back then, it did not gain interest, or at least not until 1920 or thereabouts. It was at this time that crystal meth was made. This was also a more efficient method that did not require the same precursors or complicated process as used previously. This novel way to produce meth and the surprising efficacy led to a search for a use of this new wonder drug. This included everything from depression through to being a decongestant. This, of course, also led to its abuse during the Prohibition era to get a high of sorts. The history of drugs, and especially methamphetamines, goes well on from here. Florida man uses it to fuel his superpowers. Those same phenomena seen in Florida and other places is exactly what made it popular during World War II. With this bit of background and knowledge, we can look to see how it was used by the militaries of the world, and do so by studying Germany as a case study. Germany issued methamphetamine tablets to every soldier and officer across every force. This was both as a pill and prescription form, but also in ration packs. Where the USA gave out chocolate and cigarettes, Germany distributed meth. This was to allow them to continue fighting for as long as possible. The arguably best example of this was the Blitzkrieg invasion of Poland. Over the Second World War, millions of doses were distributed. The use of amphetamines let soldiers continue to march, fight, and die for days on end. This was essential for the speed and continuous activity of Blitzkrieg operations. Soldiers might travel hundreds of kilometers over a few days, fighting regularly throughout there. Nominally and normally, soldiers would be fatigued at the end of one day of fighting, let alone days and days of it. Tank crews would be unable to operate for so long as they'd fall asleep and become fatigued. Methamphetamines were there to counteract it. It should come as no surprise that the widespread use of a strong drug like crystal meth is going to create problems no matter why it happens. This is true for one simple reason. Relying on someone who is not an expert to accurately and reliably judge a dose of a given drug that is highly addictive and incredibly potent is a recipe for disaster. The ignorant or uneducated soldiers and even officers would simply take more and redose themselves if they thought it appropriate. Such an approach inevitably led to problems. The most apparent is going to be overdosing. If you don't know how much you're taking, when to retake it, and what the effects are going to be, you could easily overdose. A similar phenomenon seen by drug abusers in the current day. This is not just the problems that we are familiar with today in substance abuse though. Those of course being paranoia, erratic behavior, and aggression. It also included less desirable effects. Chronic abuse of it could quite easily lead to delusions, hallucinations, and many other effects. Even with that, it was a popular option amongst civilians and the military. Soldiers were known to request that their families send them it as a supply. Gradually the Wehrmacht figured out that sending methamphetamines out as a ration wasn't a great idea, and eventually it was no longer issued as that. This was for a few simple reasons. The first is that production was limited by Allied bombing. If you destroy enough facilities, eventually you are unable to source what you need. This of course meant they had to prioritize who got it. The second reason was more important. That is, Germany no longer needed to sustain soldiers for days on end as they charged through enemy territory. Instead, they were fighting a constant losing battle as they were forced to retreat. The soldiers gained nothing from never being able to rest as they constantly fought the Russians or the Allies. Even with that, higher-ups in Germany at the time wanted soldiers to keep taking it and were telling soldiers to keep taking it in the hopes that they could keep fighting. This inevitably led to death. The deaths were a big issue. What soldier will be confident in their command when told to take a drug that is known to kill them? It was still issued, but still on a much smaller scale, generally to pilots, who were often grounded due to air superiority by the Allies, to specialists who were operating in very specific situations, and similar. This would have saved a great many soldiers from dying of things like heart failure or committing suicide during a psychotic episode. Even then, that didn't mean that meth did not go beyond Germany. In fact, the implications of meth go well beyond Germany and all the way to Japan. Japan was where meth was solidified into crystal form in 1919. This is also one of the reasons why Japan was a major manufacturer and user of amphetamines in World War II. It could be argued that after Japan's surrender, they had the most serious issues with meth. The simple reason for this is that Japan pushed for its use widely. They stockpiled massive amounts. Soldiers and workers would use it regularly. That was there to improve their productivity, and they consumed it not only during the war, but after the war. When Japan inevitably surrendered after the atomic bombs were dropped, they had a large amount stockpiled, and this was led into the domestic market. The drugs being led into the domestic market went one of two ways. Either into the domestic market, where it became the world's first drug epidemic, or it went into the black market and was sold illicitly. The reason for this is that people were already using it, soldiers were familiar with it, and it was then sold to the public as medicine for all kinds of issues. Given Japan's cultural shattering by the atomic bombs and surrender, it's no surprise that the country, at least in part, turned to drugs. It's also true at this time that the Yakuza were able to generate a great deal of revenue by trafficking methamphetamines. The final noteworthy point is just who used the most amphetamines in the world, and interestingly, that would be the USA. America gave it out to pilots on long flights to stay awake and active. Admittedly, this was a voluntary use, but it was also voluntarily used by more than half of the armed forces with the United States Army. This is a practice that continued well into the 20th century. Methamphetamines continued to be a drug given to United States soldiers well into the First Gulf War. You might also know this as the invasion of Iraq. As with many things in the world, the military has been a significant factor in the development and widespread adoption of various things. In this case, amphetamines and the widespread use of them. The reasons are exactly what you would expect. Soldiers become familiar, the government wants a way for them to be able to fight better, and they eventually figure out that these two things will match. It's the same reason why we have anaesthesia. It was one way to keep soldiers alive and put them back into the field after patching them up. Admittedly, amphetamines are not the best option available, but they are part of a much larger process by which war will drive innovation. Unfortunately, innovation in this case has led to a scourge on society. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.